Hey everyone, this is the India Story, the show for the global Indian. Look, I know the nature of the news business is that headlines keep changing, and sometimes instead of worrying about what's really big in a major national issue, we start worrying a little bit more about what exactly is happening with Ranveer Singh and with the various pictures he's taking. But today, on today's show, we're going to try and keep our focus to something that is continuing to be a really important point when it comes to India's foreign policy and the way geopolitics is playing out in our neighborhood. And I'm continuing to refer, of course, to Sri Lanka because it's not just the crisis in Sri Lanka, which may be heading somewhere with Ranil Wickremesinghe taking over. It's the broader question of India, China. I would guess the word would have to be competition in the Indian Ocean region. China has been trying to move into this entire neighborhood. India says it's the Indian Ocean, called the Indian Ocean for a particular reason. India is at the center of it. Why is China coming in with this entire string of pearls and trying to do things out here? Now, what's happening in Sri Lanka is causing a lot of people to raise their eyebrows and to wonder, what exactly is China doing? China, in many ways, did contribute to this entire problem thanks to its debt, thanks to all those white elephant projects it set up. Yes, there were other factors as well, but China contributed. And now, when Sri Lanka is in a crisis, where is China? It's suddenly being left entirely to India to try and help to whatever extent it can. And India can't do it by itself, which is why the international community has to get it. But whatever's happening in Sri Lanka and the way China is behaving is certainly a signal that many other countries are also going to be looking at. The Americans have referred to it, the USAID head saying, look at what India is doing and look at what China is doing in Sri Lanka. But many other countries will also be looking at it. And that's going to be our special focus on the India Story this week. But before we get into any of that, let's quickly take you through some of the major headlines that you should keep your eye on.
Congress leader Adhir Ranjan Chaudhary apologizes for calling President Draupadi Murmu Rashtrapatni after scathing criticism from many, including Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Chaudhary said the remark was a mere slip of the tongue. After the suspension of 24 opposition MPs this monsoon session of Parliament, opposition parties start a non-stop dharna for 50 hours near the Gandhi statue. Leaders from opposition parties protested in a relay system, with some staying all night. Aviation regulator DGCA has ordered SpiceJet to operate at only 50% of its capacity for 8 weeks, cracking down on the airline after an unusually high number of safety incidents in recent times. SpiceJet says no flights will be cancelled as a result of this order. The World Health Organization chief has advised at-risk men to consider reducing the number of sexual partners they engage with, as 98% of cases have been observed in men who have sex with men. More than 18,000 cases of the disease have been reported globally, and the WHO has declared the outbreak a global health emergency. Prime Minister Modi inaugurates the 44th Chess Olympiad taking place in Chennai. India is hosting the tournament for the first time, and 30 Indian chess players across 6 teams, mentored by Maestro Vishwanathan Anand, will represent the country.
Okay, let's now dive in a little bit into the China factor when it comes to Sri Lanka. I know China and Chinese apologists have been saying for a long time, look, we only contribute 15% or 20% of the debt in Sri Lanka. Don't blame the airport. Don't blame Hambantota. There are other reasons why Sri Lanka is in a mess. But there's enough evidence on the ground right now that yes, that debt trap was a factor that pushed China into this. It is certainly a fact that the Rajapaksas were so clearly pro-China, and their entire attachment to China helped contribute this to. And then you can add pandemic, you can add tourism hate, and you can add fertilizer policy, add whatever you want. But the fact is China did play a role in this. And now, when the chips are down, where is China? That's a question the Sri Lankans have every right to ask. And that is a question that India and Indian foreign policy makers should also be putting forward to other countries, that if you're looking at the various development models that there are in this region, that's what the Chinese did when it came to Sri Lanka, and that's the India development model. And both need to be studied carefully.
As the new regime in Sri Lanka tries to maneuver the country out of its worst crisis in decades, many have stepped in to help. Ranil Wickremesinghe, the new president, will need help from the international community. Neighbour India has already stepped in to help in a big way. But one question has been on everyone's mind: where is China? As Sri Lankan protesters stormed the presidential residence in Colombo, the Chinese embassy released no statements. Beijing's assistance to its self-proclaimed all-weather friend has also been found wanting, especially given the fact that many think it has contributed to Sri Lanka's current state. A symbiotic relationship between the Rajapaksas, the erstwhile ruling family of Sri Lanka, and Chinese leadership has been posited as one of the major reasons for the current crisis. Mahinda Rajapaksa first took oath as president in 2005, assisted by his siblings who held key portfolios. The Rajapaksas came to power in the wake of a decades-long civil war, which they were able to end because of a fast-tracked and unrestricted supply of weapons and ammunition from China. China also bucked international pressure and defended the Rajapaksas against charges of human rights violations. From 2005 to 2015, China emerged as Sri Lanka's leading source of development assistance and FDI. China seized the opportunity to invest in several mega infrastructure projects, which often lacked the possibilities of returns, but allowed the Rajapaksas to show them off as a sign of Sri Lanka's growing development and reap political benefits. China saw these investments as opportunities to further entrench its influence in the country. China preyed on Sri Lanka's economic vulnerabilities and loopholes to further its own political and economic ends. For the Sri Lankan government, the easy inflow of money allowed the leaders to ignore structural weaknesses in the country's economy. By 2019, the value of Chinese development finance in Sri Lanka had reached $12 billion. And when the road China helped Sri Lanka along led the country to crisis, Beijing went missing. Many have said that China deserted Sri Lanka and the Rajapaksas. Some analysts argue that China is eager to disassociate itself from the Rajapaksas, who are now immensely unpopular politically. Beijing did not help its longtime allies to escape their country or provide them asylum. China also did not actively respond to Sri Lanka's request for debt restructuring. In June, it denied Sri Lanka access to a $1.5 billion credit line and did not respond to requests about a $1 billion loan to buy essential commodities. China's treatment of Sri Lanka may be a cause of worry for multiple other countries who have similar investments from Beijing. More than 40 low and middle income countries owe debt to China, which is more than 10% of the size of their annual GDP, who may need to seriously reconsider their method of relying on Beijing's investments. China's approach to the crisis and consequent aid is in stark contrast to India. While China has sent emergency grants worth $76 million, India has already provided over $3.8 billion in assistance. India's aid supplies have included rice, kerosene, milk powder and medical supplies, which have often kept the country's emergency systems going, which may otherwise have died. While others have fled the scene, India has stuck around in Sri Lanka's darkest hour. This has also created an opportunity for India to show the world that its development model is different. As showcased in India's investments into countries like the Maldives, Afghanistan, Guyana and Niger, New Delhi's model is not predatory, but based on mutual respect and sustainable development.
So to try to understand what exactly is happening in Sri Lanka, what is the role that China is actually playing? Is China helping? Having created a lot of the problems to start with, is China helping or not? And if not, why not? And what should India's stance be in all of this? We're being joined by two real experts in the field. It's a pleasure to have with us Ambassador Ashok Kanta, who's the Director, Institute of Chinese Studies and a former diplomat, former ambassador to China, actually, not that many years back before things really started to go south. So it's a pleasure, sir, to have you with us. And Professor Harshvi Pant, Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation, been doing a lot of work recently on what actually is happening in Sri Lanka and happening with respect to China. Ambassador Kanta, if I can just start with you first. What is, look, everyone's looking at the situation and many people are scratching their heads and saying, why is China so silent? After all, Rajapaksas were virtually their creation. They did the BRI. They're the ones who got Sri Lanka into a debt trap. And now that Sri Lanka is actually facing with the crisis, China seems to have washed its hands off and, said, deal with it yourself. It's, we only have 15% of your debt. It's nothing to do with us.
Vikram, as you rightly pointed out, China has contributed to Sri Lanka's present economic crisis, though it's not the only factor. There are multiple reasons behind China's current economic predicament. The fact that Sri Lanka under then President Mahinda Rajapaksa borrowed heavily from China for projects which are seen to be white elephant projects like, Hambantota Port, Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, and many of the projects which are not yielding results, but at the same time account for a fairly large share of Sri Lanka's debt burden. China mentions the number of 10%, but if you take into account the commercial loans given by Chinese entities, the number goes up to almost 20%. So it's not made in China crisis, but China has contributed to it. Now coming to finding relief for Sri Lanka, as you said, China has kept relatively quiet during this period. China has not stepped in by giving economic support to Sri Lanka. It advised Sri Lanka against going to International Monetary Fund, partly because that involved debt restructuring, which China doesn't favor, because this would have created a precedent that would apply to loans given by China in other countries as well. So today, in fact, it's India which is left to do much of the heavy lifting, as China has kept on the sidelines. In fact, if you look at some public comments coming from then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he mentioned that China has not given support. China seemed to have shifted its strategic priority from Sri Lanka to elsewhere. So he was, in fact, more than indirectly putting some blame on China.
Right.
Now, after Ranil Wickremesinghe has taken over as president, there is a message of congratulation from President Xi Jinping. We may expect, China to step in with some support, but let's see. It's still uncertain to what extent China will come to Sri Lanka's assistance.
Right. Professor Pant, I wanted to get your understanding of the overall situation, because obviously there are signals in this that other countries will also be looking for. I mean, look, a lot of countries in the South Asian region, in the Indian Ocean region, Eastern Africa, were playing the China card, and many of India's neighbors were saying India versus China, and were playing that card. The fact that China, whether it was they contributed 15%, 20%, 25%, Sri Lanka's crisis was also contributed to by the pandemic, by the drying up of tourism, by some illogical decisions that were taken by the government out there. That's true. But China did contribute to this. And the fact that China has not been willing to help right now when the chips are really down, that presumably is something that other countries will also be looking at with slightly sense of concern.
Well, indeed, I think in some ways, this is perhaps a moment of reckoning, both for a lot of smaller countries in South Asia, wider Indian Ocean, Africa, where China has been seen as a country that is available for easy money. But now, when we have seen this kind of a response of China in Sri Lanka, I think there is a lot of questioning going around. But what is equally interesting, Vikram, is that their kind of discourse in Chinese language. A few of my colleagues are working on this, and we'll come out with something on this very soon. It's very interesting because there is, in China, the way they are presenting this argument amongst themselves is that, look, this so-called China card was being played by the Sri Lankans, and like other South Asian countries, Sri Lankans are also very opportunistic, and we need to double down on Sri Lanka. So I think it's a very interesting conversation that the Chinese are having amongst themselves.
So are they saying they should double down in the sense that they should help Sri Lanka right now? Or are they saying leave Sri Lanka to itself? No, they are saying that, look, we need to get our money back. And that this is something that, this creates a moral hazard problem. That if if somehow you restructure debt for one country, what happens to other countries? So I think this is a moment of reckoning, both for China in terms of how it deals with some of these smaller nations, also for some of the countries in and around, not only in South Asia, but elsewhere, that have been using China for a very long time. And I think particularly the elites. Now, Chinese silence is not so very difficult to understand, because I think what they don't want to do is to come out and say that, look, we are very close to, they are seen as very close to Rajapaksas. So, we know, for example, that Ranil Wickremesinghe is also seen as very close to Rajapaksas, and initially he was targeted. So by ordinary Sri Lankans. So I think somewhere China is worried about the longer term costs that are entailed in this if they are seen to be in any way coming out, becoming vocal. So silence is an easy option at the moment. But I think what they're particularly worried about is what happens to their investments, what happens to their money. Does it create a problem for other, when it comes to dealing with other nations? As you point out, will other nations become more proactive in defending their interests, in making transparency central part of their engagement? There is always this contestation when you deal with China, when elites versus the masses.
street versus the elites. And I think there the challenge for China going forward is going to be how do they balance it out in a world where increasingly we are seeing economic consequences being played out in the political realm. And I think Sri Lanka is a good case. We know around our neighborhood there are a number of countries that are facing enormous turmoil, including Pakistan, where China has such a large stake. So how far China will go in supporting some of their strategic ambitions, in particular this containment of India in South Asia. This is, I think, going to be a fascinating discussion going forward.
So I think it's interesting to look at the India ramification in this. And Ambassador Kanthan, I think 4 years or 5 years have passed. So, I don't think I'm breaching any secrets out here. But it was interesting about 2017, 2018, I was at Davos and Ranil Wickremesinghe and many others had sort of said, would like to give an interview. And in that interview that I conducted, Ranil Wickremesinghe seemed very clear. He would like India to play a larger role. He would like to sort of hedge against the too much of a dominance on China. And that maybe that was thinking that was coming in Sri Lanka at that time. Then the Rajapaksas came back and everything went back to more of a pro-China stance. What do you think are India's opportunities out there? What when it comes to Ranil Wickremesinghe? And in general, look, we can't afford to wash our hands of Sri Lanka. Obviously, it's a neighbor. It's like being part of the same family. So I guess India can't wash its hands of Sri Lanka the way the Chinese would like to. How do you think India should play this?
No, obviously, we cannot wash our hands off Sri Lanka. The reason we have come in as first responder and provided assistance in excess of $3.5 billion US since beginning of this year is not only because of China factor. Sometimes China factor is overplayed. I have served in Sri Lanka for 3.5 years. I know how close this relationship is. We have very strong both civilizational links and contemporary strategic interests in Sri Lanka. So it's very important for us that there's no breakdown in Sri Lanka, there's no implosion in Sri Lanka, there's no major spillover effect from Sri Lanka, as External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar also mentioned. So we have to provide assistance to Sri Lanka to the extent we can. And we have indeed done that. But we have to bear in mind the fact that our capacity is also limited. Sri Lanka's requirements today are quite large. So international community has to step in. We have been supportive of Sri Lanka getting assistance from International Monetary Fund and from other bilateral partner countries. I think we need to assist Sri Lanka in that process while providing bilateral assistance to the extent we can. So this is one aspect. When it comes to Sri Lanka's economic crisis, we help in a very proactive manner. But there's also a political dimension to Sri Lanka's present situation. And there, very rightly, we have maintained a hands-off attitude. We are supportive of the people of Sri Lanka. We have not tried to bail out any particular political dispensation in Sri Lanka. So making the distinction between the people of Sri Lanka and the system, the political arrangements or regime in Sri Lanka, I think that's a wise course of action we have followed, and we should continue to do that.
Right. Professor Pant, when it comes, so Sri Lanka is one part of it, but obviously the entire equations around the Indian Ocean region is something that India's had correctly, in my view, in the last few years. India has correctly focused a lot of attention on the Indian Ocean region. Countries like the Maldives, countries like the Seychelles, Bangladesh, others, do you think they're seeing what's happening with Sri Lanka and saying, okay, we need to recognize that at the end of the day, China may come bearing gifts, but at the end of the day, our neighbors are our neighbors?
Yes, I think to a certain extent, this recalibration will happen. And I have not been particularly worried. Often, media headlines are, if you get if India gets one project in any one country, it's a win for India, loss for China, or vice versa. I think that's perhaps a wrong way of looking at this particular challenge or in South Asia, because this is a long-term issue. Increasingly there is contestation in South Asia. This contestation will continue because South Asia is now intrinsically part of Indo-Pacific. So India being part of that Indo-Pacific narrative, which is a theater of great power politics, means that this contestation is only likely to increase. And we have to prepare ourselves for that. That look, sometimes there will be situations which will seem advantageous to India, but if we don't use those opportunities properly, sagaciously, then I think China will enter in. And I think China's entry into some of the countries has been also a response to India's inattentiveness to some of the concerns emanating from these smaller neighbors. So I think the fact that India is more attentive today, that's good news. Whether we can sustain that attention, whether those countries can continue to see India as a reliable partner is another a part of this, is another facet of that engagement. If we can continue with that, I think we are already seeing some of the results. Look, Bangladesh is a very good success story. Sri Lanka, with all the turmoil, we have seen how this will pan out. I mean, India is, if you look at the narrative in Sri Lanka at the moment, is very, very positive in favor of India. Maldives, we have seen back and forth, and again, largely a pro-India government at the moment. Nepal, we have seen some recalibration. So I think these things will continue to happen because
Seychelles would be another example.
Another example, of course. And I think that's where, again, we need to be very cognizant of the long-term challenges rather than looking at it episodically. That this project or that project or this government or that government. Unless we have a long-term, view of this, I think we will falter. Thankfully, Indo-Pacific narrative, which is driving a lot of great power contestation, would mean that this will remain at the center of not only global politics but also Indian foreign policy aspirations. So hopefully that will continue to we will continue to engage with some of these broader questions.
Right. One last question, Mr. Kantha, if I could start with you. I'm curious as to where Pakistan is figuring into all of this, because I think India, correctly so, is now increasingly viewing China as the real challenge, as is indeed the case. Inside Pakistan, I'm just curious as to how you think they're viewing, because Pakistan's been very clear. China is our all-weather friend. China is the partner who's always going to be with us. China is always going to help us out, etc., etc. Maybe they're getting a little bit concerned, seeing that when the chips are down, China doesn't always come to your help. And that's something which, by the way, the Americans have been pointing out today with the USAID and others saying this, where are the Chinese when you really need them? So do you think the Pakistanis will be getting just a little concerned seeing what's happening in Sri Lanka? Or is that a different relationship, Pakistan and China?
Vikram, when it comes to China-Pakistan strategic nexus, that's very durable and it's likely to get eroded anytime soon. At the same time, fact remains that what's happening in Sri Lanka today is a cautionary tale in terms of perceptions of China, not only in our neighborhood, but beyond. If you step back and look at, how Chinese entities had seized Hambantota port, taken it on 99-year lease, that became a turning point. The narrative of debt trap diplomacy, of sustainable debt, acquired the real life at that time. Likewise, China's inability to step in and help Sri Lanka in its present situation will be looked upon in Pakistan also. Though when it comes to Pakistan, China is more forthcoming. Last month alone, China provided a loan worth $2.3 billion to Pakistan, though at commercial terms. I believe that China will continue to bail out Pakistan because, stakes there for China are very high. And
Right.
China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is really, the flagship project of Belt and Road Initiative. And for a variety of other reasons, why China cannot afford to disengage from Pakistan.
Okay. Professor Pant, last word from you. Would you agree with that whatever we may say about the situation in Sri Lanka or Maldives or other countries, the same can't be said for China, Pakistan? They're likely to remain strategic allies for a while.
I think so. I think Pakistan is slightly different, but I think what we are witnessing now is a gathering storm of epic proportions in Pakistan, because the political crisis, this Imran Khan, making life difficult for military, which is, I think, a quite significant development in Pakistani politics, combined with the economic crisis, is a very potent mix. And the scale of the economic problems are such that unless there is an intervention by, already we know that they have gone to IMF and IMF have given them a package which is very limited given the scale. Unless the Western countries change their attitude, unless America comes in a big way, they will have to go to China and ask for greater amount of help. As Ambassador Kanta was saying, China has provided some help, but it is nearly not enough to even bail them out over the first year. So I think the scale of the crisis that is gathering in Pakistan is very, very huge. And combined with the political developments there, I think we may see some changes here and there. But at the moment, for the what we call as the policy timeline, I think China and Pakistan are likely to endure the relationship, and China will do everything possible to help Pakistan. Although whether it can and whether it can manage that crisis, that's another matter.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. You've given us lots to think about. Let's see how all these various permutations and combinations play themselves out. Thank you so much for speaking to us on Editor G. That's it for now. But to keep watching the India Story, do remember to download the Editor G app. You can get it right here. Every week, we will come back with a major theme that could be of interest to the global Indian. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.